So one of the perhaps very creative collaborative efforts that's underway is the Thunder Basin Grassland Prairie Ecosystem Association. That's a lot of words. You guys need an acronym for that. So Dave Pellatz, who is a Wyoming native, believe it or not, currently works as the Executive Director and Conservation Coordinator for Thunder Basin Grasslands Prairie Ecosystem Association, and also the range matter for the Grazing Association. So let's welcome Dave.
Well, thank you all for sticking out these last few hours of the symposium. These things are always, I think for all of us, we all have our jobs, the real world, if you will, but these are important events as well. And we'll talk about some of the things that the association has done. And by the way, the accepted acronym is TBUGP. Courtesy of Fish and Wildlife Service, the guy that we were working with at the time said, I can't say Thunder Basin Grasslands Prairie Ecosystem Association in one breath, and so you're TBUGP from now on. And it's worked for us, and it's a lot easier to say than all the rest of the stuff. And when the group put that together, I don't think they were thinking about the fact that when you answered the phone, you were going to have to answer all of that. If they had, they'd probably come up with something shorter to begin with. So thank you all for having me here to speak. We've been involved in a lot of different activities over the last couple of decades, and I'll be sharing some of that stuff with you today. Talk a little bit about the association, give you a quick overview about that, and then talk about what we've done as we've looked at some of the both program and project level planning that has gone into the conservation strategy that we have developed over the past decade and a half. A little bit about the association. We are a landowner-led initiative, a group of landowners, including my mom and other ranchers in the kind of northern Commerce County, southwest corner of Weston County, basically the area of the Thunder Basin National Grasslands, kind of the southern half. Formed the group back in 1999. They were interested, of all things, about prairie dogs. Prairie dogs continue to be an issue in that area. For all of most of you here probably recognize that. And I know certainly the commissioners that are here have had a lot of discussions concerning that issue, and it's been going on, the concerns have been going on for a number of years. And as I talked with Jim back there a few minutes ago, he was reviewing stuff from the 1960s, and it was like kind of deja vu all over again. We sometimes kind of come up with the same kinds of issues, the same kind of concerns and projects and issues that we want to deal with. And we're trying to take a little bit different approach from that. We've partnered with a lot of different people. Membership, we have partners with the coal mines. It's been a very productive partnership dating back to essentially a couple of years after the association was formed. We have one small oil and gas producer that's a member. The bulk of the association continues to be related around ag production. Cover between all of the various members about 1.2 million acres. Let's see, and my time's up. The association, you've got to throw your mission statement up there. For the group, one of the things they quickly recognized is that they needed to have some kind of science-based approach to landscape management here in Northeast Wyoming. Wasn't a lot of research that had been done in the area, and when we looked at trying to put conservation measures on the ground for some of the species, recognized very quickly that we really didn't have a very good idea of what some of the things might work. Some things obviously we tried and had worked. Some things you could learn from had been tried and had failed. Those are good things to know as well. So as part of what we do, then working in this area, basically cover the 5 counties in Northeast Wyoming, along with some areas up in Montana. Predominantly, as you all who work here in Northeast Wyoming recognize, predominantly private and state surface ownership. If you look at the subsurface, it almost flips, not quite. We're looking at about roughly a 60-40 split, 60% federal, 40% private or state in the subsurface over that 13.2 million acres that we deal with. We cover about 240,000 acres up in Montana. That was a remnant at one point. The association was looking at covering all of the Major Land Resource Area 58, which stretches way up into Montana, some 43 million acres all told, and recognized that that was just too big of a thing to swallow. Brought it down to this area and kept those couple of small parcels there in Montana. One of the things I'm going to share with you, some of the lessons that we've learned over the years, and really a very long history. The group was formed in 1999. In 2000, they started working with Fish and Wildlife Service on developing their first candidate conservation agreement with assurances, a CCAA. We wanted to capitalize on the existing partnerships that were already out there, and critically, we wanted to make sure that we could implement across all of the land ownership types that were there. That was critically important as people recognized that with not only the split estate issues where you have differences between surface and subsurface, you also had different property owners and different needs across the surface as well. And then as time went on, recognized that we wanted to really look at utilizing adaptive management. I think the discussion earlier today, adaptive management really is a very powerful tool, but it requires a lot of work, a lot of effort to actually do what the concept has the benefits that it has to conservation. In the 9 years here that lapsed between when we were starting the CCAA, basically the group decided that CCAA, which deals, if you know anything about the candidate conservation program with Fish and Wildlife Service, dealt only with private lands. That wasn't going to work because we were wanting to try to match this across all surface ownerships. And so we needed to do something else, and in those intervening years, kind of tried to figure out what that would do, gathered some additional data, and tried to put something together that would allow us to move forward. In 2009 then, we convened an expert working group, brought in 23 different federal state agencies, along with a wide variety of other stakeholders to talk about how we could do this, and specifically, how could we develop conservation measures for the 8 species that we'd identified that we wanted to focus on, and make sure that those would provide benefit to the species, that they were doable and sustainable. In 2011, after 18 months of meetings, and for those of you, some of you are in this room, participated in that, we didn't meet every day. Sometimes it felt like that. I think we averaged about meeting every 2 weeks during that time frame. And at the end of the time, we came up with 176 different conservation measures that we'd identified that would add value to that set of species, that were sustainable, and that would work here in Northeast Wyoming. Give you a list there of the species that we decided to work with. Ultimately, kind of broke that down into 2 of our primary ecotypes, both ends of the spectrum, if you will. Shortgrass prairie, you can see the list up there, the number of conservation measures that we developed to work on those 4 species. And on the sagebrush side of things, the 4 species that we chose there and the 110 conservation measures that resulted. One of the challenges in all of this was trying to work within the existing systems, both within Fish and Wildlife Service and with other federal land management agencies, Game and Fish, NRCS, et cetera, to try to move towards a landscape scale approach and looking at ecosystems versus species. And of course, that continues to be a challenge. I think we're getting better at that. We all like to say that we do it, but the reality of putting that on the ground and putting a plan together that actually does that, particularly when you're looking at the diverse needs of the species that we're dealing with, has been a challenge. A lot of discussion went into how you would make that work. So in 2014 then, we set up a specific conservation advisory committee to look at and advise the board on a number of various issues. It was composed of a subset of that expert working group. We have 13 different representatives, again, federal and state agencies, biologists, NGOs, et cetera. And they were looking at conservation priority areas. Where should we focus? How can we prioritize? and do the best things in the best places, if you will, and then look at appropriate implementation guidance for that as we move forward. A couple of the products, you're obviously not going to see these in any detail, but just give you some kind of a very quick review or a quick look at what we came up with. One of the things that we did was try to incorporate all of the data sets that we could lay our hands on. This is looking at where we were looking at conservation priority areas for burrowing owls. And this is a little different approach. We've been talking about buffers and areas where we're going to do development. This is kind of the flip side of that from the standpoint of where, if we're looking at conservation, where do we want to try to prioritize? Where do we think the habitat exists? Where can we do good things on the landscape? And then we'll factor in what of these areas really can't we work on because they'll be developed, or because we don't work with the landowners there, et cetera. So it's kind of the flip side of some of the discussions we've had over the last couple of days. The map here for ferruginous hawk, and as you can see, a much broader area, both from nesting habitat and then from feeding areas as well. And again, the same kind of philosophy here. If we're going to do things, maybe this is where we want to concentrate, but obviously we've got to be layering in all of those other uses of the landscape as well. And of course, no good plan is successful if you don't have a very complicated flow chart. So that was our attempt at doing that. We did add some color so that it would be kind of pretty on the display. The font size, I think, is almost readable, not quite, but almost. So it was a success as well. We ended up with then coming up finally with that conservation strategy. It was signed this month. So we started working at it, as you remember, back in the summer of 2000, signed now. These things take a lot of time to get put on the ground, get put together. We ended up coming up with the conservation strategy, which involves pretty much most of the conservation documents the Fish and Wildlife Service has available for both private lands where we have a federal interest, and then one that was specifically tailored to address future development of the mineral estate. That was one of the critical components that we recognized early on, is that we're in Northeast Wyoming. We will have energy development. We have had energy development, and it will probably continue on into the future. How are we going to accommodate that? How are we going to work that into a conservation system and allow for and in fact acknowledge that it's going to happen, but still have conservation efforts on the ground. So that was kind of then the overall program level stuff, fairly large scale, took quite a bit of time to put together. I'm going to switch gears for just a few minutes here and talk about some of the more project level planning type things that we do. Again, a flow chart of the process. I apologize, and really, reading the text up there is probably not necessary. It drives how we go about looking at these things as we go more site specific. But again, it's from the standpoint of putting things in the end from a conservation standpoint, not necessarily looking at things with buffer zones, et cetera, from a development standpoint, although we do recognize and acknowledge those areas where we do have development. One of the things that the group that we had put together, the members of the association, were really interested in putting things on the ground, seeing what worked, what didn't work, and we've put a fair chunk of change on the ground in various projects and various planning exercises to protect and enhance both the sage and our shortgrass habitats. Some of the projects that we've worked with there, as you can see, read yourself there at the bottom, and these have been generally, a number of partners have been involved in all of these types of projects, and we work across the board, federal, state agencies. We had, I think, funding from about everybody you could think of in that basically the last 15 or so years of putting stuff on the ground here in Northeast Wyoming. We'll again shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the support tools that we've developed that we use for that more. It's informed both the program level work that we've done, but really when we get down to project level stuff, it's been very important. Talked a little bit about some of the products that were available yesterday when it comes to sage cover out here in northeast Wyoming. That was one of the products that we had worked with and recognized, at least for the areas that we work in, the available products are difficult to use at best. And so we ended up saying one of our needs was to develop some kind of a sage cover layer that we felt would be more accurate, more reflective of what the reality here is in eastern Wyoming. Have spent quite a bit of time and effort in developing with our partners aerial imagery that then we convert, and through a GIS exercise, it's kind of that black box that we've talked about. You put a whole bunch of stuff in one side, and on the other side out comes the sagebrush cover layer, which when we've been ground truthing has ended up being a much more accurate product than what we've had in the past. You can see the area that has been covered there over the past, starting in 2012, 14, 16, and we'll be flying the purple area down there in 2017. All told, we'll end up with about 3 million acres and about 6 terabytes of data. These things are huge data sets and make them a little difficult to work with, but very highly detailed and very, very nice to work with and have that level of information. Do a lot of research. This is just one of the research projects that we've been involved with, ARS in this case, looking at fire scar studies out in, as you can see, the area there, primarily in the national grasslands. Fire scars from 1937 to 2013, and looking at what we see with cheatgrass and shrub recovery or shrub loss, and also what comes back with our perennial grasses. We also do an extensive amount of monitoring throughout the area, just looking at long-term trends both in perennial grasses and in shrubs. Have put in a number of precip stations recording basically rainfall, trying to get a better sense of why some of the things that we're seeing, how we might explain that. We have one soil moisture station that we're working with, have another 3 I think that we're planning on putting in this year as well with ARS. So a couple of summary slides here. Basically, some of what we see as the advantages for the framework. We've got a series of this 176 different conservation measures that have been vetted. That group that was working on those, basically part of the process was going back to their respective agencies and making sure that they agreed to those, that they were beneficial. And more importantly, with those conservation measures, this framework allows those voluntary efforts by our members to be counted. I think that's kind of been one of the issues that we've talked about here in various forms over the last couple of days. A lot of things with people or industry or groups doing things and saying, well, I don't really think that I'm getting, that people aren't looking at them the way that I would like them to be looked at, whether it's a federal agency or a state agency. This process allows the things that our members are doing to enter into those systems and really be counted. And it provides a way to, because you're counting that, if you will, provides a way to front-end load some of your conservation efforts. Do things before you need that conservation benefit. One thing that's very important, however, to remember is that this is a voluntary document. It is not a regulatory document. That intersection, there are ways to kind of make them coordinated and make them work together. And what we've put together is designed to complement the regulatory framework, but this is not a regulatory document in any way. And we have that interesting intersection of how do you do these good things in coordination with what's going on in the regulatory framework and make everybody talk together. And if you've all, tried to manage a kindergarten class, it's kind of about the same approach. It's a challenge, it's worthwhile, but it's a very interesting process. We've done a lot, and quickly given you kind of the thumbnail sketches of some of the ways that we have tried to look at coordinated planning at multiple scales. It incorporates both the conservation strategy itself, monitoring research, and a whole bunch of partners. We couldn't have done that without the various stakeholders that have been involved over the various decades. Want to leave you with just a few summary thoughts and kind of lessons learned, if you will, from this process. Most of these things are things we already know, but I don't think it hurts to repeat them and to reemphasize that ultimately in all these discussions we talk about agencies all the time, but we really don't ever work with the Forest Service or the BLM. We work with an individual. We work with Dwayne, or we work with Tim, or we work with whomever. And we work with those individuals. That's who we develop the relationships with. We can't develop relationships with companies. We develop them with the people that work for those companies, but it's really people to people. And it's very important to remember, as I think our example illustrates, these things take time. In our case, a lot of time. We've been working on this very intensively for 8 years, and before that for about 17 all told. But what we like to say is that effective coordination allows you to accomplish things that people say, oh, that's impossible, we just can't do that. It's kind of the analogy is, well, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. And it's kind of the same thing with this kind of a project as well. Remember that you need unity, not necessarily uniformity. We're all going to have different opinions on things. We need to allow room for those differences. And if we can, as much as we can, we need to kind of leave the good guy, bad guy labels outside the door and off the table. And for the real estate professionals in the room, we've all heard, and you probably had people tell you, it's all about location. Well, that's true. For coordinated efforts, it's, in my opinion, all about communication. That's really what it comes down to. We need to talk, and it would be nice if we could do that as courteously as possible. Although sometimes that's not necessary, but it makes lives for all of us a little bit easier. With that, I'll end the presentation and take any questions that you might have.
This is Mike with the ERG. So the concept of rewarding conservation efforts with assurances, that seems kind of creative. Was there a precedent for that, or did you guys?
For doing what?
For rewarding conservation efforts with assurances that with future listings or whatever.
Yeah. So that is the one of the programs with the Fish and Wildlife Service, that candidate conservation agreement with assurances on private lands. That program has been around, Trish, help me out, probably since the late 90s, early 2000s at least. So there aren't a lot in the U.S. At the time when we submitted to the service in 2013, that was when we put in our full-blown application, if you will. I think there were 29. So it's not, and one of the reasons for this level of complexity, it just takes a lot of time to get there, and it requires, I mean, we worked with Fish and Wildlife Service. They provided the support staff for those meetings. They were there at the table all the way through that process. So it is just a very lengthy process to get it done. I think the assurances piece that you get at the end in the event of a listing is a critical component to this. On the federal interest lands, you get a lesser standard, if you will, certainty. But we've worked as much as we can to move that certainty as close to assurances. It will never get there, but we've moved it as close as we can through all of the approaches that the Fish and Wildlife Service allows.
Andrea Orabona, Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I'm curious, that's a lot of cheatgrass that you treated. Was it successful, and how did you treat it?
So the treatments for the cheatgrass were basically looking at, those were projects that were done with UW Extension to look at plateau when we were still evaluating the effectiveness of plateau. And yes, we proved that it's very effective. We can basically take out in the study plots that we put in, you're eradicating 98, 99%. Our earliest work was done in 2006, and we're just in the process of wrapping up the final studies on that. What we've seen is that we were able to keep it out about, it looks like, about 8 to 10 years, and now we're back to what the surrounding native control areas are. So one of the questions that we have is, can we afford, with the number of acres that we have where there's varying levels of cheatgrass, can we really afford to treat every decade? And the answer may be, yeah, it's very important. What we've seen is that it may not be so important from the sense that cheatgrass will come in and take over our perennial grasses. We don't see that happening in our area, which is far eastern, Wyoming. The stuff as you get closer to the bighorns and as you move back more into the sage steppe, totally appears to be a totally different world, and there's some real challenges there, particularly as you get into the Great Basin with cheatgrass. But for us, we'll just switch over. We may convert from a cool season mixed grass prairie system to shortgrass, but we're not going to see that just dominated cheatgrass monoculture type stuff. The question is, can we afford to continue to treat it simply to reduce fine fuels for wildfires? We know that what happens is if we have these fires, obviously the sagebrush is gone, and from that fire scar study, we were seeing really no effective recruitment back into these fire scars over 70, 80 years plus. So without some active restoration efforts, we're thinking that those time frames, it probably will recruit into those, but it probably is going to be in the order of hundreds of years, which is, it's outside of our ability to really say, hey, that's management.